Going to start the recording. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Maggie, thank you so much for being here with us. Before we start, I'll tell you about Maggie. So Maggie is a PhD student in history, theory, and criticism of art and architecture at the program for Islamic architecture in MIT. Before MIT, she did a bachelor's in art history and a master's of history of religions in Copenhagen in Denmark, and she worked in various museums in San Francisco and is hosting a very interesting podcast which is called Nomads Past and Present, and which is also related to why we invited her here today. Her interest in nomadic cultures, especially in the histories and material cultures of nomadism, the uses of architecture by nomadic peoples, and historical interactions of empires and nomadic populations, as of course we can see in the NEGEV. So her PhD is called Principles for Desert Control, Architecture, Imperialism, and Nomadic Peoples During the British Mandate, which examines how the built environment was mobilized and manipulated to control nomadic peoples under the authority of the British Mandate in Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, and how nomadic groups responded to and influenced building projects intended to control and surveil them. Maggie's going to talk about this today. As always, we're going to have a talk and then open it up for questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Maggie, thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and to share this research and hopefully get some questions and feedback on this work. So to start off, I should explain the geographic and temporal scope of my talk today, which is the period of British mandatory rule in the Middle East, so 1920 to 1948 in Palestine, 1921 to 1946 in Jordan. Oh, sorry, there we go. 1921 to 1946 in Jordan and 1920 to 1932 in Iraq. And specifically, I'm focusing on this region. I hope you can see my cursor because I'm going to be using it a lot. So this region of sort of southern Palestine, southern and eastern Jordan, and all along kind of southern and eastern Iraq. And so this region is conceived of and defined by British imperial authorities as the kind of quote unquote desert corridor. And so even though these consist of separate arid zones of the Negev, the Syrian desert and the Jordanian steppe, and then the Arabian desert in eastern Iraq, this region was perceived by the British as a contiguous, homogeneous desert landscape that in turn required a separate strategy of governance from the northern and more urbanized and agricultural zones of the mandate countries. And so this perception of the desert gave rise to a British desert administration that was distinct from its operations in the rest of the mandate, and to a British policy known as the Principles for Desert Control, which was aimed at extending colonial authority and oversight and rule of law into this desert corridor. But the Principles for Desert Control were somewhat misleadingly named because this was a policy not so much of landscape or territorial control, but rather it was explicitly organized around the social control of this region's inhabitants, who were primarily nomadic pastoralist Bedouin tribespeople. And so this map also illustrates somewhat loosely Bedouin tribal polities and territories during the Mandate period, which are these gray capital names. And so within the Principles for Desert Control, the Bedouin were defined as a problem to British state legitimacy and authority because of their mobility. So the Bedouin historically practiced mobile pastoralism and livestock herding, which entails frequent migrations across large areas. And this mobility effectively rendered the Bedouin seemingly invisible within the framework of the modern nation state. And so the principles for desert control set out a strategy for surveillance and control over the Bedouin that was organized around architecture and ushered in a large-scale building program across the desert corridor to essentially create symbols of imperial presence manifested in architecture. And so likewise, these points on the map are some, but not all, of the sites developed by the British during the Mandate period as sites of Bedouin control. And so this topic is a case study that's representative of a very common historical phenomenon, which is this kind of nomad problem, or rather what states perceive of as a nomad problem, and in turn, a state-imposed architectural solution to this problem. And so we find examples in many regions and time periods of state building projects towards nomadic peoples, aimed usually either at kind of keeping nomads out. So these are large-scale defensive projects, often in the form of walls or chains of fortifications. The Great Wall of China is perhaps the most famous example of this, but there are other examples like Imperial Russia's border walls with in Central Asia, in the Kazakh steppe, and in Crimea, or the Roman Empire's defensifications of its northern and southern and eastern boundaries. And then you also have state building projects which are aimed at keeping nomadic peoples in. So essentially the enforced sedentarization or enforced settlement of nomadic peoples and their confinement to a designated area. And the Native American reservation system in North America is probably the best known example of this phenomenon. But there are also state sedentarization projects for nomadic peoples all over the world, especially in more recent history. So modern China's projects for villagization on the Tibetan steppe, which I find architecturally very fascinating, or these post-independence Bedouin settlements in the Gulf states are examples of this phenomenon. But what's interesting about Mandate Britain's architecture for Bedouin control is that it doesn't fall exactly into either of these categories, and it doesn't really qualify strictly as either an architecture of defense or separation or an architecture of constraint and settlement. And so the question that's raised then is, how is Imperial Britain's architectural control over the Bedouin performed, if not through a kind of literal control and surrounding of human bodies and human mobility? How did Mandate Britain set out to transform the built and natural environments of the desert in order to bring about changes in Bedouin behaviors and effectively make the Bedouin controllable and legible within the framework of their colonial project? And so those are the questions that I'm going to try to answer in this talk. So as I already mentioned, British strategies for governance over the Bedouin were articulated in the Principles for Desert Control policy document, although these strategies took a while to be worked out and perfected, and I'll talk more about that later on. But I want to discuss this document and its contents briefly and point out what it tells us about how mandatory authorities perceive the relationship between the Bedouin and architecture. And so the document opens with a statement that the ruling factor in all desert operations in Arabia is the vastness of the distances involved. And so from this sentence alone, we sort of begin to understand the problem that Imperial Britain felt itself to be faced with in its governance of the mandated territories, which is that to British eyes, the desert zones of these countries appeared as almost kind of uncomprehendingly vast and hostile. And there were no comprehensive maps or surveys of the region available. And while the Mandate Authority attempted to visualize and understand the desert through the use of modern technologies like aerial surveys and photography, like those that are pictured here, ultimately it seemed like an almost impossible challenge to establish colonial presence and authority through the use of military manpower alone. And so the author of the Principles for Desert Control continued to say that it is absolutely hopeless to expect to be everywhere present in sufficient force to deal with any disturbance which may occur. And so the solution to these problems of the sort of vastness and seeming unknowability of the desert and the mobility of its inhabitants was devised by the British in the form of a strategy organized around the use of architecture as a mechanism of control. And specifically, the strategy was premised on a colonial imaginary of the physical and symbolic force that permanent architecture was believed to possess in specifically nomadic contexts. So even though it was written about 10 years into British mandatory rule, the Principles for Desert Control were based on relatively little direct knowledge of Bedouin communities and only a kind of superficial understanding of Bedouin cultures and lifestyles. And so to the passing European observer, the Bedouin were very easily assumed as being synonymous with a specific mode of architectural building and dwelling, which is basically that the British defined the Bedouin as lacking in architecture. And so the black goat hair tents, which the Bedouin commonly, but not exclusively lived in, were taken as evidence for Bedouin backwardness or primitiveness, and in turn became a kind of justification for British presence in this region in its role as the self-proclaimed modernizer. And so the idea that permanent architecture didn't exist among the Bedouin was stated quite explicitly in the Principles for Desert Control, which claimed that a stone wall is to them anathema, basically saying that architecture in permanent materials was something that the Bedouin would instinctively be afraid of. And so the Principles for Desert Control put forward a racialized ideology of the Bedouin as not only lacking in architecture, but as being afraid of or intimidated by its very presence. And so from this idea about nomadic peoples' perceived relationship to permanent architecture, colonial administrators arrived at the conclusion that architecture as an entity and by its mere presence could wield control in this context. So Britain's desert control strategy revolved around the creation of a network of so-called desert outposts, the locations of some of which are marked on this map. And so the desert outposts were essentially militarized forts located at sites frequently visited by Bedouin tribes and occupied by imperial police officers who were responsible for surveilling Bedouin movements and activities and controlling Bedouin access to natural resources, which I'll talk about more later on. And so while the sites developed under the Principles for Desert Control look very much like traditional military fortifications, I argue that these sites weren't primarily designed to fulfill the function of kind of conventional fortifications. Because how these sites operated within British strategies for control wasn't primarily through the defense of an internal garrison, and neither were they carceral spaces designed to physically constrain the Bedouin, and rather it was actually quite the opposite that was the case, because these sites were envisioned as exerting control even when they were unoccupied by imperial soldiers, and they were also explicitly defined as spaces which the Bedouin were not even allowed to enter. So in designing the desert outposts, British administrators assumed that, quoting here, the tribesmen would be more impressed by the exhibition of solid, unmovable strength within his midst than by any kind of significant military or police presence. So instead of acting as conventional militarized spaces, which often wielded violent forms of control directed towards the human body. The desert outposts were envisioned as exerting a kind of control over the human mind, because as the imperial logic went, if the Bedouin were afraid of architecture, then just seeing a stone fort in this landscape was enough to induce fear and therefore bring about a kind of order and compliance with colonial authority. And so the solution also kind of neatly circumvented the logistical and physical control problem posed by Bedouin mobility, which is that rather than attempting to sedentarize or settle the Bedouin, the principles for desert control allowed the Bedouin to continue practicing mobile pastoralism under this kind of constant symbolic presence of government surveillance in the form of imperial architecture. And so in the rest of my time today, I'm going to walk through how this policy was implemented, how within this context, permanent architecture was both physically constructed and symbolically imagined to exert control over people, space, and resources, as well as the long-term consequences of this policy on the built and natural environments and inhabitants of the desert. And ultimately, what I think this story reveals are not just historical strategies for localized desert control or Bedouin control, but rather further reaching colonial ideas of and practices for controlling colonized spaces and peoples through manipulations and transformations of the built environment. And so the story, as I've laid it out, proceeds in 4 acts, or through the lens of 4 materials: water, stone, oil, and concrete. And the first 3 of these each reveals a different dimension of Britain's desert control policy and its underlying ideologies, while the last, concrete, illustrates the policy's repercussions in the final years of the mandate and into the post-colonial period. So we begin with water, the importance of which in a pastoralist context can't be overstated. Bedouin migrations are organized around the seasonal access to and availability of water. And early on in the mandatory period, administrators identified key wells as sites where Bedouin tribes could reliably and predictably be found. And so, somewhat inevitably, Britain's desert outposts were all strategically located at watering places known to be seasonally visited and maintained and used by migrating Bedouin tribes, both for their own use and for watering their livestock. And so situating each fort by a Bedouin well was justified as a practical necessity, that if the outposts were to be habitable by imperial soldiers, they had to be situated near permanent sources of water. But in actuality, the primary strategic effectiveness of the outposts and their location was through this kind of architectural annexation of pastoralist water resources. And this was later articulated in an oral history interview with Commander John Glubb, who was Britain's chief liaison to the Bedouin in Iraq and Jordan, and the primary author of the Principles for Desert Control policy. So he said that the desert, of course, depends on wells most of the year. So we built a fort on every well with 8 or 10 men in it. The result was the tribes couldn't get water unless they came in under the control of the forts, and that established complete control of the tribes. And so the construction of the outposts went hand in hand with the maintenance and expansion of water resources on the part of British authorities, so digging for new wells or repairing existing ones, which was presented as a kind of act of colonial benevolence. But again, according to John Glubb, if the government were to finance the repair of the water supply, it would give us sufficient pretext to control the water supply, and the remaining water would be free to all comers under police supervision. So what's interesting about this is how it's presented in British documentation as allowing the Bedouin to remain nomadic and effectively is sort of fostering and supporting pastoralism rather than forcing the Bedouin to settle. They're allowed to continue practicing pastoralism But in doing so, they have no choice but to encounter these omnipresent symbols of imperial authority and surveillance in the form of these outposts, which in turn are mediating and determining Bedouin access to natural resources. And so again, sidestepping the problem of trying to limit human mobility, and instead what's being bound or confined is water, resulting in a kind of transformation of water and water resources in the desert from a fluid entity to one that's to a static commodity that's bound by architecture. And so this all met with fairly intensive resistance from the Bedouin to a degree that was perhaps unanticipated by the British. And perhaps the most intensive expression of resistance was an attack in 1927 on the outpost at Busaya, which was the site of a major Bedouin well in southern Iraq. And so the fort was attacked and destroyed by a group of Bedouin tribesmen while it was under construction, and the construction workers working at the site were killed. And the perpetrators of the attack were never identified or found. The British accused King Ibn Saud of neighboring Saudi Arabia of sheltering the attackers, which sparked a whole diplomatic incident between the British and Saudis. And this was one of the more violent expressions of resistance to the principles for desert control and its architectural and manifestations. But in other instances, Bedouin leaders lodged complaints and petitions against this seizure of their water resources, or simply left British-controlled territories and migrated to neighboring Syria or Saudi Arabia. But somewhat ironically, it was actually this resistance to the outposts in their initial stages of conception and construction that convinced the British that this was an effective strategy, as this opposition towards the outpost seemed to validate British conceptions of Bedouin hostility towards permanent architecture. Some administrators nevertheless objected to the policy for being too kind of totalitarian in its control, and especially after this attack on Busaya, administrators were afraid of copycat attacks and argued that maybe the proposed strategy should be abandoned rather than risk further alienating the Bedouin. As one administrator wrote in a memo objecting to the principles for desert control, he said that outposts must be sited near water sources, and the implication is that water is brought under control of an established authority, whereas nomads by tradition claim sources of water is in their own lordship. But despite, or perhaps because of, such objections and the resistance of the local population, the architectural program of the principles for desert control that was first trialed in Iraq was expanded and implemented on a wider scale across the desert zones of Iraq and then Jordan. And so in the next section, I'll talk more about the form and appearance of the desert outposts and the transformations of existing features of the built environment that were undertaken as part of this project. And so, as I already mentioned, in the interest of cost efficiency, the outposts were strategically sited at major sites of water. And a second key cost-saving feature that was taken into consideration by mandate administrators in identifying the locations of the desert outposts was the availability of existing building materials. And so many of the outposts were sited at the ruins of earlier Roman, Byzantine, and medieval Islamic era buildings, which were identified by mandate administrators as sites to be basically mined for the building materials that they offered, and their building materials repurposed in the construction of the desert outposts. And so the Principles for Desert Control document identified several locations throughout the Jordanian desert where stone is available from old buildings in the vicinity. And specifically, administrators looked to Roman ruins for spolia to be used in the building of the desert outposts. And so, for example, the Roman era fort at surveil was razed to its foundations, and its masonry was repurposed into an adjacent desert outpost. And scavenging of the region's architectural heritage was presented and justified as an expedient cost-saving measure, but it also allowed the British to cast themselves in the architectural footprints of previous empires who had ruled the desert and its nomadic inhabitants. So modeled on Roman fortresses with these high defensive walls and central courtyards and crenellated towers, and in many cases built with the exact same materials, the desert outposts were envisioned and presented as returning to a Roman imperial model of desert control. So in the British historical imagination, the Romans had been the last empire to successfully manage and control the desert and its inhabitants. And so Roman era architectural legacies were repurposed into structures that were at least superficially indistinguishable from ancient architectural precedents. And so the reuse of building materials from antique ruins was also leveraged and justified in the Principles for Desert Control as a way of circumventing the illegality of many of these building projects. So in 1925, the British Empire representing Jordan signed with King Ibn Saud of the state that would become Saudi Arabia, signed a treaty governing the delineation of the Jordanian and Saudi border. And a key clause in the treaty explicitly stated that the two governments mutually agree not to use the watering places and wells situated in the vicinity of the border for any military purpose, such as building forts on them. And so it's difficult to interpret this as meaning anything other than forbidding the exact kind of building projects, forts on wells, that the British would go on to construct. So there were some amount of internal kind of negotiations among the British as to how the desert outposts could be justified diplomatically in light of this treaty, with debates over what is a fort anyway, how far away is the vicinity of the border, what are military purposes exactly. So within this hair splitting over terminology and definitions, by citing the desert outposts at existing forts and using their same building materials, the outposts could be presented and defended diplomatically as just replacements of existing architectural fortifications, where no new buildings would be required, and the construction of the outposts wouldn't appear as an infringement on the sort of architectural status quo of the desert. And so under the Principles for Desert Control, the architectural history and heritage of the desert were annexed as well, and kind of constructing and projecting an image of Great Britain as simply resuscitating alleged Roman precedents of desert control, rather than developing and executing a modern mechanism of colonial control. And so the desert outposts sort of become a ship of Theseus paradox. If a building is built in the same materials as a Roman fort to look very much like a Roman fort, is it still a Roman fort? And so by physically controlling and manipulating the materials of the desert's existing architectural features to in turn control and shape historical narrative, the Principles for Desert Control weaponized history to retroactively justify Britain's social control over the Bedouin, kind of painting a veneer of historical precedents over modern colonial methods of extraction and surveillance. And a further completely overlooked aspect of the history of the desert outposts is that several of the pre-existing buildings that were co-opted by the British through this strategy were not just Roman ruins, but also fortifications that had previously been developed by Bedouin tribal leaders. And so these were primarily built during the late Ottoman period, when several Bedouin tribes throughout Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq acquired a significant degree of political and economic power and autonomy within the Ottoman administration. And several members of the Bedouin elite constructed stone fortifications that, for their own part, look very similar to earlier imperial precedents in this region as well. And these fortifications also often served a similar purpose of control in that they denoted Bedouin tribal ownership of land and resources, as well as conveyed the power of the sheikh as being someone with the political and economic and social capital to patronize and commission such building projects. And so there aren't a huge number of such projects. There are 4 of these Bedouin-built forts that I found in my research so far. But they demonstrate active Bedouin participation in the construction of permanent architecture and architectural fortifications, which is typically only ascribed to state or imperial actors in this context. But then what happens in the Mandate period is that all of these buildings are seized by the British and transformed into desert outposts. So these sites that were originally developed by the Bedouin for internal purposes of control were weaponized and directed against the Bedouin. And so in the case of Khalid al-Jafar, it's mostly torn down, and the stone is repurposed in the building of a desert outpost that's directly adjacent to the original Bedouin-built fort. Rutba in Iraq is completely destroyed, and a desert outpost is built on top of its foundation, so nothing remains of the original fort. And then the forts at Kaf and Mudawara in Jordan were actually not destroyed or transformed at all, but simply maintained as they were and reoccupied by the British administration as a desert outpost. And so much like the annexation of Bedouin water resources, the co-optation of these forts gives rise to fairly intensive expressions of resistance on the part of the Bedouin, and results in actually what is the closest that Bedouin tribes come to organizing full-scale revolt against Mandate Britain, where the tribal leaders whose property has been seized start coordinating with other tribes on the Saudi side of the border to organize an armed revolt against the British. But British authorities find out about these plans and basically pay the tribal leaders who were affected restitution for the value of their property, and the revolt sort of dissipates. So it's important to note here that while, as I said earlier, the architectural strategy of the principles for desert control were based on this idea of permanent architecture as something that a nomadic person would instinctively be afraid of, the British were aware, at least on some level, that that wasn't true, and they were obviously aware of Bedouin building projects in permanent materials such as these. So part of the intention and consequences of the principles for desert control and the annexation of Bedouin buildings was to effectively create this figure of the anti-architectural nomad that otherwise wasn't really a historical reality. And so under this conception, where architecture and specific modes of architectural building and dwelling were understood as markers of civilization or a lack of civilization, the British essentially tried to force the Bedouin into a position and perception of technological backwardness and primitiveness by severing their access to the built environment. And so this appeared also in how the Bedouin accessed and used the desert outposts, which is to say that for the most part, they didn't. So members of the Bedouin were not allowed entry to the forts themselves, and rather there was an associated guest tent outside each fort, where British officers would go to meet with Bedouin tribal representatives. And so nomadic encampments were perceived as being ideal for maintaining colonial security, because I'm quoting, people who live in stone houses may commit crimes in secret, unknown to their neighbors. This is almost impossible in the case of people living in tents. Every tribesman knows what the other has done, and any knowledge of raiding or smuggling activity will not remain secret for long. So the British understood the desert outposts as representing the arrival of civilization to the Bedouin, but not necessarily for the Bedouin. And so the stone outposts with the tents of the Bedouin camped outside of and around them represented and reinforced in terms of architectural materiality the separate zones or spheres of civilization to which the Bedouin and the British were perceived as belonging. And so it's impossible to talk about the architectural and infrastructural history of this region and moment in time without talking about the oil industry, which is a very large topic in its own right. So I'm going to limit this discussion to one specific building project of the oil industry and its effects on and interactions with the Bedouin. So in 1927, oil is discovered in northern Iraq and is immediately exploited and commercialized by European and American oil companies. But the problem that these companies had was transportation and how to get oil from Iraqi Kurdistan to European markets. And the solution was the Mediterranean pipeline, which ran from the main oil fields of the Iraq Petroleum Company at Kirkuk to its terminus at the port of Haifa, and traversing the Iraqi and Jordanian desert and steppe along the way. And so on the one hand, the geographical remoteness of the pipeline was seen as a benefit to the oil company because no permanent settlements impeded the pipeline's route, and the land itself was sparsely populated and could be quite cheaply leased from its respective state governments. On the other hand, the Bedouin inhabitants of the territories that were to be bisected by the pipeline were perceived as a real threat to the safety and economic viability of the pipeline. And so geologists and surveyors and oil company executives predicted that tribespeople would inevitably interfere with the pipeline and raid construction sites for materials and equipment, or damaging the pipeline itself. And so the Iraq Petroleum Company's concern was how to protect the more than 500 miles of the pipeline as it ran through the desert. And so from the outset, Mandate Britain's desert control policy was intertwined with the needs and interests of the oil industry. So desert outposts were constructed at each of the pipeline's 8 pumping stations, from which Imperial police officers surveilled the surrounding region and protected the stations and pipeline from attack. And the oil company also employed its own tribal liaison officers, whose assignment was to be in regular contact with tribes under their jurisdiction and to report signs of raiding and smuggling or interference with the pipeline, not just to the oil company, but to British Mandate authorities. And so the efforts on the part of both imperial and private commercial actors to control the Bedouin mutually supported and reinforced one another. And so the arrival of the oil industry in the desert precipitated a shift in long-standing Bedouin migratory patterns and subsistence methods. The pipeline's pumping stations required enormous amounts of water, both for the operations of the pumping stations themselves and for the use of the 50 or so European employees who lived at each station. And each pumping station was located at a site where groundwater was determined to be available in sufficient quantities. And the development of these water resources by the Iraq Petroleum Company was seen as a net positive for the Bedouin. And supplementary reservoirs were developed at each pumping station for dedicated use by the Bedouin and their livestock. At the same time, the Iraq Petroleum Company lobbied British Mandate authorities to limit water resources used by pastoralists in other parts of the desert, as the development of the groundwater supplies of the desert in the interests of livestock is bound to have an adverse effect on the yield and life of the company's wells. And it was also acknowledged as a regrettable but unavoidable consequence of the development of water resources at each pumping station that this would dry up existing water holes currently used by the tribes. And so as a result, throughout the 1930s and 40s, Bedouin tribes began to coalesce and settle around the pumping stations, where water was plentifully available and where tribesmen could also seek employment with the oil company as manual laborers or guards. And for the Mandate administration, this unintended consequence of the oil industry's presence was in many ways a benefit, because the localization of tribes around certain known points made them easier to surveil. And the oil company could also contribute towards keeping watch over the Bedouin. But the oil company couldn't provide enough employment for all the tribespeople who gathered around the pumping stations. But at the same time, due to the presence of the pipeline, pastoralism was becoming increasingly untenable as a way of life. So even though, as I said earlier, sedentarization or settlement wasn't explicitly a goal of the Principles for Desert Control and its building program, in many ways, these sites of Bedouin control did end up becoming sites of Bedouin settlement and permanent villages in ways and for reasons that were perhaps unanticipated by the British initially. And so finally, I wanted to point to the expansion and implementation of some of the ideologies and practices contained in the Principles for Desert Control across a wider area than just the deserts of Jordan and Iraq, and namely the connections between the architectural strategies of the Principles for Desert Control and those of the Taggart Proposal, which was implemented across mandatory Palestine after the Arab uprisings in the late 1930s. And so, like the Principles for Desert Control, the Taggart Proposal hinged on architecture and specifically the construction of purpose-built forts and police stations and prisons and border walls, known as Taggart forts or Taggart walls, for surveillance and incarceration and the constraint of human mobility. And so these were much more literal and physical forms of architectural control than the desert outposts, and they take quite a different form as well, in that they were designed around the presence of large numbers of police officers and soldiers who would both defend and be defended by the forts, that were also designed to withstand a months-long siege if necessary. And another major difference between the desert outposts and the Taggart forts was their material, in that while desert administrators relied on stone, the author of the Taggart Proposal, Charles Taggart, insisted that the new police stations and barracks in Palestine be built with steel-reinforced concrete, and continued to insist on this even when the outbreak of World War II made the availability and import of steel both difficult and expensive. Because in Taggart's mind, concrete was a symbol of the modern British Empire and its hegemony over the landscape and its inhabitants. So where administrators in Jordan and Iraq saw the use of stone as a way to demonstrate British continuity and inheritance of the legacy of previous empires, in Palestine, they see concrete as pointing to the imperial future, in which concrete resonates as a symbol of technological advancement and modernity. And so the Taggart Proposal is most commonly seen as having been informed by Charles Taggart's service in British India, where he was instrumental in suppressing local rebellions in West Bengal. And so while historians have emphasized the connections between British colonial practices in India and the Middle East in this context, the more local connections between imperial strategies within the mandate system, I think, have been overlooked. So in developing the Taggart Proposal, Taggart looked not just to his prior experiences in India, but also to the work of his fellow imperial administrators in Jordan and Iraq. And he cited the Principles for Desert Control as a source of inspiration to the Taggart Proposal, writing that the outbreak of violence in Palestine could be attributed to its poor system of architectural defenses. And as a solution, administrators in Palestine should look to their colleagues working among the Bedouin in Jordan and Iraq. And additionally, although the Taggart forts were designed to be far more militarily defensible and secure and much more kind of true fortifications than the desert outposts, they also relied on this idea of architectural control through symbolism and a kind of control over the human imagination, in addition to control over the human body and mobility. So in a report validating the Tegart proposal, the principal desert administrator in Jordan, John Glubb, wrote that police stations and barracks were a crucial pillar of governance in this context because, I'm quoting, they constitute a concrete reminder that the government still exists and will soon return in force. And conversely, the abandonment of police posts, their burning down by the rebels, and the withdrawal of the government forces gives an enormous fillip to rebellion. The brains of the Arabs is in their eyes is a common local saying. A fort with a flag flying has a moral effect quite out of proportion to its real power, just as the blackened ruins of a burnt and abandoned barracks produces an impression on the Arabs much in excess of its real importance. So this kind of racialized ideology of the Bedouins being easily intimidated by these permanent monumental building projects starts to get extrapolated and applied to the Arab population of Palestine as a whole, and informs this building program in which, much like the desert outposts, the Tegart forts were designed to be sort of inescapable to Palestinians and to create these both physical and visual symbols of an omnipresent British imperial surveillance and control over the wider population. And so finally, just as a coda to this narrative, a phenomenon that I find really fascinating about many of these sites, both the Tegart forts and the desert outposts, is their longevity as sites of control in the post-mandate context. So the Tegart forts remain in use as prisons and police stations and military headquarters, and many of the desert outposts in Jordan and Iraq have been adapted by the post-independence governments of these countries for the same purposes as military bases, but more often as prisons. And so these contemporary projects exhibit a kind of state-level recognition and leveraging of these existing sites as ones of control, although there's a kind of inversion of the British intentions behind these building projects, and that now these sites are no longer directed towards the Bedouins specifically. Rather, they house, for the most part, political prisoners from across kind of the wider country, and in some cases from across the Arab world. And unlike how the British conceived of the outposts as not constraining Bedouin mobility, now these very much are spaces of carceral confinement and a very literal targeted control over the human body and human mobility. And further, what's being leveraged and taken advantage of by state regimes through their uses of these sites today is the seeming invisibility and unknowability of the desert, which is exactly the problem that the British initially set out to solve through the principles for desert control. But in this context, the features of the desert that were so frustrating to the British, the large distances, the underdevelopment, the low population densities, now become quite useful to states carrying out all manner of human rights abuses at these sites in secrecy and outside of public oversight. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wow, Maggie, thank you so much. This was so interesting. Really, it was incredibly interesting. And I think that you're right in saying that these monuments of surveillance, as you called them, these principles, these outposts, are really hardly known, or not enough known. I mean, I actually did my bachelor's thesis on the Tegart forts in Israel and Palestine, and I always knew that the precedence was the Indian kind of stuff that Tegart did when he was in India, and I didn't even know that there was such a local precedent. So it was really interesting for me to see. Like, I wrote down ask her about Tegart, and then of course you arrived to them. So it was so interesting, and also the idea that these things became really monuments of control even after the mandate had left. And I'm not sure if you know, but in the north of Israel, there was this very specific kind of linear tiggerts that have been like along the border with Lebanon, which have actually become the symbol of the Israeli border control, Mishmar Gvul, until today. So it's this British mechanism that has been so well adopted and adapted here that it really became like the local symbol for the control. So as you say, the longevity of these buildings. And I'm not sure if you've seen, but in Israeli news in the last week, there was some encounter with the Egyptian border with some Egyptian soldier, police officer shooting a few Israeli soldiers there. And it's interesting because on that border, there are relatively new outposts that look a lot like the Jordanian Iraqi ones, but they're made from like a very thin material. So it would be interesting to see this evolution from the stone to the concrete that you pointed out. And then finally, just to this very thin, it's almost just like an enclosure with the two towers, which is kind of reinforcing your thesis that it's not just about this mechanism, this police headquarter, but it's really about being this monument of supervision, being this anchor in the landscape, in the desert, kind of flowing, desert landscape, to have this kind of outpost. And I found it really interesting. Maybe you can comment on that, how it seems that part of your primary material is not just archival images and field research. You told us you're going to live in Jordan for a year, but also the report written by a person of power, speaking, of course, in a very paternalizing, orientalizing, even this idea of writing about the tribesmen. And how did you come across these documents? Maybe, I mean, I have many questions, but how is it like working with these documents and extracting or extrapolating from them spatial conclusions, or kind of learning reports like that as a primary source?
Yeah, the archival sources for this project are tricky, which is to say that, I mean, there's a wealth of archival material on this period and place. There's, a lifetime is not enough to read everything that the British wrote. They really loved documenting things, which is great for the historian. But of course, the challenge becomes, how do you balance that? How do you not kind of over privilege or give too much weight to sort of British perspectives on the Bedouin, which, on all of their encounters with colonized peoples, which are extremely racialized, extremely problematic. But what I find really interesting about these documents is this kind of cognitive dissonance that they exhibit in terms of how, so like I said, the British are on the one hand putting forward this idea that the Bedouin have no affiliation with permanent architecture, that it is something that a nomadic person will like instinctively abhor, will be afraid of, will resist building material or building projects in permanent materials. And at the same time, they're completely aware of the fact that members of the Bedouin themselves commissioned, patronized, lived in, used permanent buildings. So like that's where my information on these Bedouin built forts comes from, in large part is from British archival sources, where they say quite explicitly, this fort was built by X tribal leader, and it was built using, this sources of labor. It cost this much money to build. So they have plenty of information about these building projects. And, it's not like this is not a secret. This was not unknown information to the British, but how they're able to both present those sort of facts and historical realities on the one hand, but on the other hand, kind of completely dismiss them and sort of just like ignore those facts because they simply weren't convenient, because they simply weren't a truth that the British kind of wanted to believe, because they didn't serve colonial projects, I find really interesting. And but it's challenging, certainly, to then know, what can you believe? What is the actual, what is actually happening here? And so I am I would like not to rely on British archival sources as much as I kind of currently am. It's just that is the research that I've been able to do so far, primarily, is getting access to the British Colonial Archive. So that's what I'm basing a lot of this material on so far. But yeah, as you said, I am going to be spending more time in Jordan, and I'm planning to access Bedouin and family archives dating to the Mandate period. So I'm hoping that, so things like letters and petitions submitted by Bedouin tribal leaders to British authorities, photographs that were taken or sort of organized by Bedouin tribal leaders before this this kind of full-scale encroachment of the British into the desert. So photographs of these sites and how they were used kind of before they were transformed into desert outposts. I'm hoping that access to those materials will, kind of provide a counterbalance to this narrative. I don't know if it will kind of disprove or completely change anything that I've said so far, but it would certainly be nice to not just rely on, the words of these colonial administrators.
Will you be also traveling around to look for trace or to see some of these places or to photograph them? Or
yes, I mean, the security becomes an issue. As I said, many of these are now prisons and are not are not easy to visit as just kind of a tourist. So I will do my best. My plan is to, of course, to visit the ones that are easily accessible. For some of the ones where security and access might be an issue, we'll see what I can manage. But yeah, that is my plan, to visit more of these sites in person and document them.
Amazing. Thank you. Maybe now I can ask if anybody in the audience, one of the students or faculty that's with us, has a question.
I could ask a question, as always. Hi, Maggie. Thank you so much. It was really interesting and also nice to, after having talked to you in person about this in the past, to kind of see both the scope and how it's organized and the places it can go. Obviously, as historians do, I'm going to ask something about like my personal interest in this. But I'm wondering as to the question of war and resistance in the context of this. So I know there's quite a lot of talk later, likely towards, let's say, Second World War and so on, about the question of communication and speed as a kind of form of control. And it seems that this kind of fortification and desire to make mobile things and humans sedentary kind of goes against what would very quickly become the kind of paradigm of how to, like, you control actually by controlling roads, by controlling movement, but controlling communication and so on, rather than by being in particular places. So I'm wondering actually, and this perhaps ties into the things that you will find out once you're in Jordan, and whether there is a kind of advantage that the British are recognizing in nomadism, in the ability of the Bedouin to actually control vast territories without, let's say, advanced technological means. Because these are also things that we are now, you know, beginning of the 21st century, we're like looking back and we're trying to understand what kind of, you know, different understandings we have suppressed, right, through our own mechanisms and our own views and so on. So I'm wondering if there's any, if you found any hints, or if you can speculate as to any hints of the kind of recognition that we have today, looking back at colonial histories, whether there's something kind of bubbling under the surface there, or whether there's some form of resistance from the Bedouin actually against this, kind of capitalizing on their understanding of this territory. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these are such interesting projects because they're so kind of old school from a military strategy perspective. Like these forts and their architecture is already by this period very outmoded. And they are supported by kind of modern military technology to an extent, and that there is some attempt to coordinate between like the soldiers occupying the desert outposts and aerial surveillance. So there is some attempt to link this kind of boots on the ground knowledge to this like eye in the sky kind of colonial knowledge and surveillance. But I do think, I mean, I think you're right in what you're saying, that whether they fully realized the extent of it or not, in this context, the British really did build on top of, sometimes, like I said, sometimes quite literally, build on top of Bedouin modes for controlling this landscape, in that the Bedouin already had these very sort of worked out and kind of highly developed systems for desert control, essentially, for controlling the landscape, for controlling individual tribally owned and managed areas of land, for controlling individual or tribally owned and managed wells and water resources, and that often the control of those entities was performed through architecture, through the building of new forts, or through the kind of manipulation and maintenance and ownership of existing fortifications. And so, like I said, the British kind of try to obscure that like Bedouin history to the extent possible and kind of present this as a Roman like imperial model. So there's a very strong kind of historical resonance or historical narrative that's being constructed and performed of the sort of connecting the British Empire to the Roman one, which in turn seems to justify a British presence in the region as basically saying the last empire to successfully manage this landscape was also a kind of a European foreign one, not rather than an indigenous one. And so we are kind of justified and we are kind of correct in being here because we're the heirs of the Roman Empire in some way. So I think that's what generates a lot of this strategy and its sort of appearance as really, for the most part, kind of trying to avoid modern military techniques and strategies and principles, and why these seemingly more kind of arcane or out-fashioned or outdated ones are put forward in this context. Did I answer your question? Kind of.
I think it's really interesting. You were saying about kind of past rulers of this land, and I don't know a lot about, but I know some about Ottoman control, and especially late Ottoman control. And I don't know about Jordan, but the only city that the Ottomans built during their 500 years, more or less, over Palestine was Beersheba. And what they built was what we now know as the old city of Beersheba, even though it's as old as Tel Aviv. And it's basically a grid meant to sedentize or domesticate the nomadic populations of the area into a grid system. And the grid is, until today, it's a bit of this kind of awkward shape because it was meant to hold not a nuclear family model, but like a clan in each of the 60 by 60 square meter grid. And it's kind of like opposite approaches. The Ottomans trying to enclose in the grid, like to parcelize and enclose, whereas the British having these kind of outposts within like the vastness of the desert. And one is the more kind of instrumentalizing really an enclosure, and the other one is really about surveillance and optics, essentially. So I think these like modes of operation are kind of opposite and are interesting to consider this evolution as well.
Yeah, I mean, as you notice, I didn't really talk about Palestine or like the Negev desert and British building projects in the Negev, even though there were some to an extent, but really in Palestine specifically, and in the sort of desert administration of Palestine, the British basically thought that like the Ottomans did a good job. That was one of the few areas where they gave the Ottomans any kind of credit, and pointed to projects like Beersheba and a couple other sites that the Ottomans developed in the Negev as not quite exemplars, but basically said that, you know, the Ottomans sort of already did a lot of this work for them and didn't really see much room for improvement on Ottoman forms of administration and Ottoman architectural kind of governance in the Negev. So it is interesting that, yeah, like you said, those Ottoman building projects in the Negev, like Beersheba, do differ so much from what the British built in the deserts of Jordan and Iraq, and that they didn't try to implement those very highly planned and modular sedentarization projects, but that the form of surveillance through architecture becomes much more sort of spread out and diffuse rather than very narrow and localized. And I'm honestly not sure kind of why that is and why exactly that happened that way, and why the British didn't try to kind of create their own Beershebas in southern Jordan or southern Iraq, perhaps simply just, you know, resources and capital and the lack thereof. Yeah, but there is a very distinct difference between British administration and architecture in the Negev versus in the deserts of Jordan and Iraq.
Yeah.
Hi, Maggie. Thanks a lot. It was fascinating. Really, I'm much more curious now to go to Jordan than ever. And I wanted to ask you something about this really interesting distinguish that you made between the stone and the concrete on the Tigat fort. And like, I was wondering whether they had some debate or discussions or just some writings about what is the style that we should build or how should it look like. Because in between that story in Jordan and the story of the Tigat fort, like the chief architect of the Public Works Department in Palestine, King Bob Harrison, he was trying to combine the two. Like the buildings were built in concrete, but yet again he covered them in stone and created something that some scholars call colonial regionalism. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering whether they were questioning that.
Yeah, I mean, so in Jordan and Iraq, in the desert outposts, it's extremely explicit in we're trying to make these look kind of as ancient as possible. That's stated quite sort of at, at face value. So that's sort of, there's not much more that I can say other than that's very explicitly what they were trying to do, is trying to build or to kind of imitate and copy these perceived precedents of antique military fortifications with some minor adaptations, kind of in the interests of sort of modern military needs. So there are some additions, like they are, some of the outposts are surrounded by barbed wire fences and things like that. So there are some minor adaptations and some use of kind of new materials.
Maybe I'll address my question again, that like Bob Harrison was fascinated by what he's seen in Greece, and he was fascinated by the regional architecture, and he made a lot of drawings. So you see that he's quite amazed by what he's seen, and he's trying to do a homage, you can say, some Orientalism, you could say it. Yeah, well, so maybe my question is whether they were fascinated by what they found in their writings, and they said, yeah, we should copy it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, like whether there's a kind of aesthetic appreciation of what they were seeing. To an extent, I think, but maybe less than you might think, actually, because there was, I think what you have to keep in mind with these projects is that they were going to be inhabited by the same people who were designing them. So there's not really like an architect, a professional architect. There's not a public works department really involved with these projects. It's very much through the military branch specifically, who's both designing the outposts and then the sort of members of which are going to live in the outposts. And so there's this interesting, or I don't know if it's actually that interesting, but there is a sense among the figures who are developing and creating this image of, okay, what should these desert outposts look like, that they're actually not going to be very comfortable to live in. So there is this, I don't know, I guess there is a sort of military aesthetic of this like sort of Spartan building that kind of has to be uncomfortable and sort of unappealing and very like bare and stripped down and not modern in a way, and that is sort of the appropriate condition for a modern, for a soldier and for a military man to live in, that you kind of have to be suffering in some way, and if you're not, then you're doing something wrong, basically. So there is this I don't think they set out to make these buildings beautiful or comfortable. They really were very simplistic, and that was seen as the ideal.
I don't know if it's related or not, but to Oren's question, but Oren, maybe I'm thinking from 19, I mean, it relates to what you said, Maggie, about the ancientness of it all, but from 1917 onwards, as many of us know, the British decided that in Jerusalem, you may only build in stone and anything else will be dismantled and not approved. Anything glass, metal, wood had to be demolished, and only stone was allowed to create this ancient effect that is still enforced today. So I think maybe in Jerusalem, this kind of a romantic military governor who had this idea of the stone as being the unifying effect, the kind of creating this image of the ancient. In Jerusalem, it was about holiness, but not in this case. But maybe, as you said, this like it's a bit like Albert Speer, no? I mean, Speer was also building in the same years, in the 30s. I mean, Speer was a bit after, and this was a bit before, but you know, maybe these years, these 1920s, was the moment in which building in stone had a certain gravity and power to it that was really attempting to resurrect this, as you showed us, these like Roman forts, to make it seem as if they've always been there, and there was always some kind of a force there looking at us, and you know,
Right.
checking that we're not misbehaving too much. So I think, yeah, that's a really interesting
certainly
thing, Owen. Yeah, thank you. I don't know, maybe one of the students want to ask, or maybe we will let you go because it's been an hour and a half. But do we have any last questions from anyone?
I think
No.
יש לכם איזה שאלה? ליה? פה שתיקה, אבל חיים.
Okay. Great. So Maggie, thank you so much. This was really, really, really interesting, and I'm glad it was recorded so many can refer back to it in the next months or years, and hopefully we'll see you at the school. When you're there,
yes, I love that. Yeah,
here.
thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good luck with the research and the move, and hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you. Take care.